Good afternoon. On behalf of the School of Public Health here at Georgia State University, I'd like to welcome all of you to the 2022 John R. Lutzker Lecture Series. We have individuals attending, obviously, here in person, but we also have many attending virtually as well, for a combined total of over 230 guests. So really pleased to have so many of you joining us to honor the distinguished Professor Emeritus, Dr. John Lutzker. John is a former founding director of the Mark Chaffin Center for Healthy Development here in the School of Public Health. Dr. Lutzker's contributions to the school have really been invaluable. He's dedicated his academic career to advancing scholarship in the service of preventing child neglect and is an internationally recognized expert in the field of child maltreatment. He's responsible for developing one of the few evidence-based child maltreatment and neglect prevention programs, Safe Care, implemented throughout the U.S. and internationally. And his efforts have elevated the Mark Chaffin Center of Healthy Development to being a university research center that is committed to preventing and addressing child developmental delays, child maltreatment, and sexual assault, facilitating social, emotional development and well-being competencies, and promoting meaningful inclusion and quality of life for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The Lutzker series is funded by an anonymous donor and allows the School of Public Health to host an eminent scholar selected each year by a national peer advisory board to present a public health topic. At this time, I want to invite Dr. Kathleen Baguette, Director of the Mark Chaffin Center for Healthy Development, to introduce this year's speaker.
Good afternoon and welcome. It is with great enthusiasm today that I welcome and introduce Dr. Iheoma Iruka. Dr. Iruka is a research professor in the Department of Public Policy and the founding director of the Equity Research Action Coalition at the highly esteemed Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina. Dr. Iruka is leading projects and initiatives focused on ensuring that minoritized children and children from low-income households, especially Black children, are thriving in the early years through the intersection of anti-bias, anti-racist, culturally grounded research, program, and policy. She serves on numerous international, national, and local boards and committees, including the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, the American Psychological Association's Board of Education Affairs, the Brady Education Foundation, and Trust for Learning. In addition to being on the National Advisory Committee for the U.S. Census Bureau, she is a Census Advisory representative for the National Urban League. Dr. Iruka is the recipient of the 2022 American Psychological Association Mid-Career Award for Outstanding Contributions to Benefit Children, Youth, and Families. She's published over 70 articles and chapters, and in the past year, she has given over 70 invited talks to national, state, and local research, policy, and professional organizations. She holds a bachelor's in psychology from Temple University, a master's in psychology from Boston University, and an MS and PhD in applied developmental psychology from the University of Miami, Florida. And importantly, she is the mother of two curious, brilliant, and joyful children, a 9-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son. At this time, we will hear from Dr. Iheoma Iruka, whose presentation is titled The 3 Ps of Protection, Promotion, and Preservation, Centering Race and Racism in Developmental Science. We reserved time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers, so please hold your questions until that time. And Dr. Iruka, please accept our warmest welcome.
so much, Dr. Baggett, for having me, and of course to the Dean for inviting me to be part of this amazing, amazing lecture. And I want to tell y'all, this is the first flight I've taken since February of 2020. I know, so for those of you that showed up and those who are live streamed somewhere, I'm honored, and you all are honorific. So thank you for having me. And I should say, for those who know me, and I have a few besties in the audience here, I was traveling every single month. So to stop it was a godsend in many ways. So thank you. But I'm honored to be here, and I'm so glad that my invite stayed, because UNC did beat Georgia State this past weekend. So, I mean, I'm a hurricane, so I really don't, but I'm glad that my invitation still remains. So thank you so much. And before I get started, I just want to obviously again thank Kathleen, thank the school, and just thank obviously John Lutzker for the work that he's done to really support the well-being and development of young children and families and communities. So I'm so grateful to just be able to be in the speaker series. I don't take these things lightly, so thank you so much. So I'm probably gonna walk around a bit, so if you don't see my slides, it's okay. And so what I hope to do is take you on a journey. But before I do that, I do wanna take a moment to honor where I live, which is in North Carolina in the Research Triangle Park, and is the land of the Lumbees, a reminder of Native people and their lands that were taken through attempted eradication. Right? And so it's important that we acknowledge the land that we live on, work on, build our wealth from. Especially if you think about health disparities, and we know Native people have been harmed by COVID-19, but also the intergenerational trauma from all the damage, the dehumanization that's happened. I also like to take a moment to also thank Black bodies. For me, as a Black person in America, I'm always reminded when I go to many places, including here in the South, about how much Black people not only contribute to the art, the science, but also to just the buildings that was done through forced free labor. And how much did they continue to make the wealth of this country go forward and still be unrecognized, unrewarded, but their lives are challenged from all kinds of, name the number, wealth disparities, murder rates, infant mortality, maternal mortality, name it all. The Black community sits at the bottom of it, even though their whole entire body has been used to create the land that we literally have built the wealth off of. So I want to make sure I thank both the Native who really, their land was taken, and then those Black people, those enslaved people whose free labor created the wealth of this country. So thank you for giving me that moment to acknowledge these folks. So, I won't say a lot about the Equity Research Action Coalition other than I came back to UNC, yes, I came back to the oldest historically white institution to do work on racism. I know. But I will say that when UNC asked me to come back, I knew what I wanted to do. And that was to really do what is now called the Equity Research Action Coalition. And the idea is that for me, I'm a developmental psychologist. I studied issues on birth to age 8, but I also knew that my power, my knowledge around the impact of racism, but not just the impact, but the cultural wealth, particularly of Black people, needed to be told. We needed a different narrative. We need to go from, oh my goodness, poor Black people, to also understand the level of wealth we had, the way that we move, the way that we think, the way that we thrive, the way that we cackle, even in the midst of many tears. Right? So I wanted to make sure that we are able to tell the full humanizing story of Black people through research, but also to make sure it impacts policy and program in many ways. And so the work that I do at UNC through the Equity Research Action Coalition is to bring to life Black humanity, right? And also to focus on other people of color, other communities of color, because if we don't humanize people of color, then they get used and abused. And then the disparities we see is not a surprise. Right? These disparities that we all know about, they didn't come like, oh my goodness, it's a surprise. They were structured, and I'll say a little bit more about that. So really our job and my job as part of the founder director is to make sure that we continue to make sure the science is truthful, that the science we do is grounded in honesty and research and interrogation through a culturally grounded lens. And so hopefully, feel free to go to the website and you'll see the number of works that we do both in research, in policy, as well as in mentoring, support, and training. So for those of y'all who are leaving, I know some of y'all already are like, I gotta go, Iheoma. So just before you leave, because no, I appreciate you all coming in person. I mean, I'm pretty sure this is probably the most people that's been on campus, at least this side of campus for a while. So I really appreciate you all coming. But also for those who have to, something happens with your Wi-Fi, I want you to know my take-home message. So if nothing else, you at least know where I'm going to go. So this is the Google direction. This is the destination of our Google. So first is, we need to understand that racism, right, and I'll talk a little bit about it, is a multi-dimensional construct, right? It's literally, as they say, the DNA that makes this world go. It's in your university. Just like it's in Chapel Hill, it's in the city, it's everywhere, right? Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not working as intended, right? So we need to understand that part of it. And second is that we have to attend to protecting families and children from harm and trauma and just violence. But when you protect them, you also have to promote their health, their wealth, their well-being, their access to educational excellence. But to me, most importantly, you have to preserve their humanity, right? It's one thing to say, I'm gonna protect you and give you some money. I'm gonna maybe promote you and give you some education. But if I literally strip all of who you are, whether your land, your people, your whole entire culture, your language, if I strip you of that, you are basically what I mold you to be. So when I think about the 3 Ps, I think about you have to do all 3. You have to protect me, yeah, that's the beginning. But you have to promote the best of who I am. But you have to preserve the depths of my humanity, right? You have to preserve my culture, my language, my identity, my family unit, the way I construct it. So that is the 3 Ps that I'll talk a little bit about. And then finally, I feel like for me as a researcher, right, I feel like I was well-trained-ish, right? Like you think you were well-trained-ish, and then you realize I have to do some unlearning. As a researcher, you're told research goes in one way, you do it this way, you remain objective, and just move out of the way. And then you come to realize research is not that objective. It's not, right? When I study, whatever I study is not that objective. I'm doing some objective pieces of it, but there's a lot of who I am is present in that, who I decide to select, the kind of questions, my theories. And so hopefully with the research, with the RISE 3 framework that I'll talk to you about, you realize that part of doing research is not passive. There's an active part that we have to attend to, and part of that is how we think about anti-racism in our research, how we think about culturally grounded research, and how we think about the cultural wealth that many communities have. Even if you go to, what part of Atlanta would you say is the most challenged, if I could use that word? What part of Atlanta is the most challenged? The South, okay. So now, but if you go there and actually sat back and observed with a culturally grounded anti-racist lens, you'll first recognize the South is created that way and probably specifically created, maybe a highway ran through it, maybe back in the day it was like where a lot of the Black communities thrived. I'm just guessing, right? But if you go and watch and observe, you'll see there's probably a lot of beautiful things happening. Maybe there's families who are coming together. Maybe there's music and art being made. There's probably so much happening, but all you see is kind of this challenge. And so how do we begin to kind of operate in a way that sees the fullness of a community from a lens of cultural wealth and also a lens of racism? Because when you understand how racism is baked into communities, into society, you begin to see it's not the people living in the South's fault. It was created and structured specifically that way, and is maintained so that the rest of us who are not in the South could thrive, drive our Benzes and do everything else, right? So that's important to understand. So that's my take-home message. So if you don't agree, you can turn off your whatever you're watching or go home. So, but I hope that tells you where I'm gonna go for the next, give or take 30 or so minutes, 35 minutes. So just to do some ground setting. And for you all in public health, this is normal stuff. Like what I'm gonna talk about is probably gonna be like, I got this in Public Health 101. But I'm hoping that this new, I would say, framework, and I wanna make sure to give a shout out to one of my besties, from another mother and father, Dr. Tanya Darden. She's also part of this work that we are impressed now. That's the RISE framework. So the RISE framework really stands for Racism plus Resilience plus Resistance Integrative Study of Child Ecosystem. And so the paper's already in press now, and I'm happy to send you all the link. But I want to just take a moment to kind of just walk through this. And again, this is an adaptation of a lot of different frameworks the firm from Cynthia Garcia Cole and colleagues, critical race theory, the bioecological framework, the lifespan. For us, we needed to have bring the frameworks together. And number one, that talks about the racism is in the air. Like cultural racism is in the air. It's in the white supremacy ideology. It is in the idea that no matter what you do, we're gonna still have racial disparities in education, in social welfare, in so many impacts. We continue to see the same numbers, even after billions and billions of dollars, right? So we have cultural racism is literally the water, the air that we're bathed in. And then of course we talk about structural racism, which means it's structured through policy, it's structured through social labor, like labor laws. For example, let's take labor for example. So you have a whole thing around who's a teacher. In early childhood, there's a teacher who's in schools, it is a child care provider. Depending on what line you're in, you could be making $11.64 versus $32. But you literally do the same job. But because of the way the labor laws are written, you child care teacher, you will get $11. You pre-K teacher in schools, you get $32. Those are policies that are literally written. So structured means that it's been structured in a way. And of course, I'm not gonna say the country's racist, but however, what you probably recognize that a lot of the policies are written in a way that literally structures certain groups to always get less than, right? So we have to begin to look at our structure of our systems and our policies in many ways. And of course, interpersonal racism is the bigotry we have. We have mostly, white people are gonna always be the presidents, they're gonna be the leaders of universities, and then, those who are black or brown get to sort of work the night shift, the labor, et cetera, right? Those are all the interpersonal racism. We see that all the time, right, in many ways, even the way that we think about each other. You see a sort of a brown person or Latino walking down the street, like, oh, I wonder if they're documented, right? Like those are the things that has been baked in. And so we interact with those kind of beliefs in mind. And of course, internalized racism. I think this is a part where for those of us who love children, right? That is a powerful, powerful system that's been created when children themselves internalize their worth. And I'm not gonna show the video. I always show one of my favorite videos, not my favorite, but it's a video I show a lot, the Clark doll test, right? From back in the day, 1960, but I show the one from Italy. So Google the doll test from Italy, and you'll realize that kids internalize what we tell them, right? If you're often told that if you're black or brown, you are not pretty, you're not gifted, all the negative attributes are on this black, brown doll, and all the positive are on this white-looking doll. That's internalized in many ways. And so we have to understand that racism has many, many parts to it. And parts are not even in here, like vicarious. For example, if you were a Latino, for example, what was happening on the border, and you saw people ripping babies that look like your babies out your arm, you actually experienced that on some level, right? When a black male, for example, gets killed, I feel something. I'll tell you a quick story. When I was in Nebraska, I know I was in Nebraska. Look, I enjoyed Nebraska. Y'all don't laugh. So I had my second baby in Nebraska. I didn't know what I was having. I assumed I was having a girl. I'm one of 7 girls. My first child was a girl. I'm assuming this baby here is a girl. And I had the baby, and they were like, oh, it's a boy. And I said, you're lying, you're lying, you're lying. I told my husband, check again. Tell them to check again. I laugh about it now, but the reason why is that I did not want to be responsible for this human being that I feared that they would not make it past the age of 10. I didn't want to have that pressure. Like, I didn't want to have to feel like, are you going to be safe? Because am I going to keep you safe from society who literally only sees not your brilliance, but sees your skin color and sees your gender and thinks that you're older than you are and may likely take your life, right? So when I leave my house and get on a plane, I'm always thinking, is he going to be safe? And I didn't want to have that burden. I just want to be a parent. I didn't want to have that burden. Like a girl is different, but it's still a burden. But the boy was one that was psychologically traumatic. And so of course I enjoy him and enjoy my kids, but it's something about vicarious trauma. When somebody who looks like your kid is harmed, you feel that, and that actually impacts you psychologically. And I'll talk a little bit about that. That's why it's not shocking when you see the maternal mortality rate. It's not because, oh my goodness, those black women are not going to prenatal care. There's a little bit of evidence for that, but it's not that. We have come to understand that racism literally is intergenerational. We also understand the impact of both microaggressions, interpersonal racism, that those things create a whole entire biological response that then leads to what we're seeing in terms of prenatal issues or in terms of infant mortality, preterm birth weight, low birth weight. Those are not because the mothers are not educated. They were educated, right? So I think we need to understand there's an impact on these sort of structures and these kind of interactions. So that's the racism part. The part that we want to also bring forward was the cultural asset part. The fact is that, you know what? I remember I grew up in the low-income area in Boston. I'm gonna say low-income instead of the projects. But I remember a lot of times my mother was bartering, right? She was either bartering for childcare, who knew where the after-school programs were, right? So there are cultural assets that families bring, even the way they talk, the kind of family configurations, right? My mom has 7 kids, so we have to figure out, okay, who are all the aunties? And I'm not really biologically aunties, but they were all aunties and uncles, and they really helped to create a family sort of cocoon system for us, for me and my sisters, right? So what are the assets that families bring to deal with whether it's structural racism or the cultural racism or the interpersonal biases? So we need to begin to humanize people in a way that says, yes, there is all of this racism that's in the air. It literally is with you every day. It's with me. My PhD is not tattooed here, right? So it's with me, I'm experiencing it, but at the same time, there's so many assets that we have to bring. So I challenge each of you to think through, what are the assets that your families have? Their aspirations. Imagine, for example, we know for a fact that many Black people and Latinos in some instances are in debt of college. You all saw the data, in debt. But it does not matriculate to the same thing. So I can get into debt as a Black person, a white person gets into debt. The debt is different. The advantage of a degree does not work the same across racial groups. We know that from the work of many scholars like Feneba Ado, who's over at UNC, that it does not translate the same. But we still want an education. And so we'll go in debt for this education, and then it doesn't actually transfer or translate to an actual full-time job with benefits. So I think we have to understand that there's many assets that we bring to address all of the isms, right? So that's this here. I know this was just this is like 10 minutes and I just took this. So I encourage you to look at the paper and really think through the racism and the cultural aspect. To me, that connection is what's most important as you work with families and even as you do your research. There's a TED Talk by Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story. So think about your families, your communities in a way that's not single lens. Put your lens on and see the duality of their lives, the challenges, but also the brilliance of working through systems that were not built for them. Think about that. The fact that some of us made it through college, made it through a whole PhD, going through a whole, historically white institutions, you should be giving us a whole Nobel laureate because, and it's funny, but it's true, right? If you understand the ground, the energy, right, that some of us are probably gonna die early. That's why it's called weathering. That even if we look like we're standing up here, we are dying, and we need you all to understand, to see both the structural inequities, but also the assets that we bring. So I challenge you all to think about that with your communities and who you work with. So again, I'm gonna show a few data points because I'm a researcher, I love data. So I'm gonna show a couple of data points. I'll go through them relatively quickly. They're actually in a couple of reports because I wanna make sure I get to the policies and really doing policy analyses, particularly for public health. So this data is just showing you, it came from the Rapid EC study, Phil Fisher's team, formerly at Oregon, now at Stanford. And basically, we sort of are doing a lot of work focused on Black families, and this one is with babies in particular. And in essence, what you'll find is that COVID-19 impacted everybody. Like, we can all agree, it impacted everybody. But it's not the same impact. So for example, what we see here in this data is that, so on this left-hand side, the purple side, is our Black families across, and this is telling you by week of the COVID-19, and on this blue side is other families. And then we also separated by income level. So the darker income level, the darker trends are really the middle income families, and then the lighter colors are families below or near poverty. The same thing for the families who are not Black. And you can see that, yes, there's a lot of families that are just struggling, right? But for Black families, there's a lot, and you can see how it actually goes up and down, right? That's the idea that, yes, you can be poor, right? Both groups are relatively poor, but you can see that for Black families, a good chunk are really experiencing a lot of ups and downs. Think about living your life in sort of this economically vulnerable position where literally, if the check doesn't come, something's going to change. If somebody gets sick and you can't go into work, a whole thing changes. So think about the economic vulnerability of your families And we saw that even for our middle-income Black families, you can still see it's not as flat. See how this one's a bit more flat? For our Black families, regardless of income, you see this level of cycling, and that's really, really psychologically harmful. And then, of course, there's the wealth gap. So to me, a lot of times we talk about poverty. Yes, poverty is bad. As somebody who grew up in poverty, it's bad. Nobody gets home and says, my mother didn't say, oh, you know what? I want to raise my kids in poverty. That's not what happened, right? There's a whole story to it. But what I think we need to think about is, yes, there's links between poverty and health outcomes, poverty and many other educational outcomes. But the thing that we often don't talk about is wealth. Wealth is what you need to get you through a global pandemic, a tornado, a hurricane, somebody dies, all the emergencies. When you don't have wealth, you are dependent on something, a miracle to happen many a times. And what we see is that for Black families and Latino families in particular, you can see right here, so the Black families are in green for those who can see, and the Latino families are here. So in 2016, white families had about 180,000 median household income wealth, right? And then our Black families had about, give or take, 13 to 14. Our Latinos a little bit higher, about 16, 17. Oh, where are we? This is 2019. So 2019, right before the pandemic, what you see is that the Black wealth did not go up. If anything, it actually went down. So the Black wealth in 2019, and this data was just released by the census a month ago or so. So about 14,100 is the median wealth for Black families. For Latinos, it went up to about 31,700. For our white families, 187,300. And for our Asian families, about 206,400. That's your median wealth. So basically, take away all of the debt you have. This is what you have left. So think about it. Y'all live in Atlanta Metro. $14,000, what's that gonna do for you? Exactly, so it's not shocking when people are homeless, and can't, come to work. So think about the wealth gap. And if you don't have wealth, that really positions you to be vulnerable. You'll take a job without benefits, because at least it gives you money. Right? You'll sort of live in institutions and live in places, even if you know that they're not treating you well, but it gives you money because you do not have any wealth. And wealth, remember, is passed down generationally. The fact that it's flat is because it was structured that way. There's a reason why it has literally barely moved. Yes, we go on TikTok. There's a lot of people with wealth. Yes, well, they don't have wealth, they have money. There's a distinct difference. Wealth is passed down generationally. You could be rich one day and be poor the next. And we know work by Chetty has shown that if you're a Black male and you're actually living in the upper middle class, you have a high chance of, as an adult, of being poor. So here you have, your family has done everything that they say, you know what, I'm gonna make sure that you get all the education, we're gonna be wealthy. By the time they're adults, those Black males are now living in poverty. And it's not because they're dumb. It's because we have structured it where Black males in particular are vulnerable to society and how they're treated, the opportunities they get, et cetera, and locked up, et cetera, right? So again, remember, wealth is what you should also focus on. So as you do your work, I encourage you to think about the issues of wealth as well. Moving along, there hasn't been a lot of studies that looked at, parents of young children's experience with discrimination, right? Because we think, oh, kids and families, they don't talk about discrimination stuff, that doesn't matter. But we know it matters, right? From work from David Williams, we know that those experiences actually impact your well-being, it impacts your sort of aspirations and so many other things. And our data continues to show that Black families, compared to other families, even compared to Latino families, Asian families, et cetera, we continue to see that Black families report a much higher level experience discrimination. Things like being denied service, being fired, et cetera. What I will point out is that the dark color is before the pandemic. And the lighter color is not after, because we're still in the pandemic, is during the pandemic. And what you do see is that it's lower. It's not saying that discrimination ended. It just means that I'm wearing a mask, I'm not around society as much, and so my experiences of, say, being called a slur or even redlining, some of those things have reduced, not because society is like, oh my God, better. It's just that my experiences and interactions are now different, right? Because now we have a lot of it was we were stay at home. Don't forget, this is until March 8th, and so there's a lot of stay-at-home orders. People are not really going into a lot of different places, so it's lower, but it's still higher for Black families compared to other families. So there's also the psychological trauma of experiencing things just because of your skin color as well. And then, of course, we understand that these issues are both, whether it's structured or interpersonal have an impact on people's well-being. As I said earlier, it's not a shock when we look at the low birth weight for Black families compared to other families. It's much higher, about 15% for every 100,000 live births, right? Low birth weight is a problem, y'all. Low birth weight and preterm. For those of us in this space, we understand it predisposes children to cognitive challenges, potentially behavioral challenges, and other kind of challenges. Preterm birth is not something that people just say, oh my goodness, I want to have a preterm baby. We understand that there's issues why it's higher in Black families. Again, not just because of prenatal. It's right, the idea that, oh, I'm pregnant and I don't want to go see a prenatal. Some of it is, right? Health insurance, the quality of doctors with Black families. Yes, we see that. But we also know that there's issues in terms of how experience of racism is being actually processed in sort of the womb, and we have evidence of that. So I'll recommend for you to read the National Academy's report, Vibrant and Healthy, where we talk about it's actually due to a lot of the intergenerational trauma and contemporary trauma that when you're pregnant, a lot of those stressors really impact the sort of the womb. And of course, I don't have to speak about the maternal mortality. I think you all have pretty much a high rate with Black mothers in particular, right? Or Black birthing people. So again, this is a huge number. It ticked up a bit during COVID-19. It actually also ticked up for for Latina birthing people, right? It ticked up almost, before they were lower, but now they look like they're a lot like the white birthing people. So the thing is that we have to continue to watch these numbers with COVID-19 and of course all the continuous stressors that Black people in particular especially have. But we also know these numbers look similar to Native people. So I want to point out that a lot of the numbers we have in terms of low birth weight, preterm, and also maternal mortality, we see a similar, almost close to a similar number for Native people. So again, there's different experiences are impacting the health of mothers or birthing people, but also their children, right, in the first sort of, when they're born. And then of course, I'll just briefly mention the issue of household and home. Let's understand this. The one way to address wealth, people will argue, is your home. Right? If you think about it, you buy a home for $250,000, like if you did like maybe 3 years ago, and then this year is $1 million. What? You are rich. So think about it. So your home in many ways is your engine for loans, is your engine for building wealth. So that's been used, but you know for a fact that Black people in particular were actually, restricted from even having that, right? So now that you own a home, so for example, we know the home ownership rate for Black people is still the same as it was in 1960. 1960, less than 50% of Black people own homes. So let's get that, that's one fact, right? If they own a home, their equity is lower. So, right, so here you are, you barely own a home. When you do, the equity is lower. Because why do we care about equity? That's where the money moves, right? You take it out, you can open up a business, you take it out, your kids are going to college, they don't have a student loan, right? So there's a lot of movement in that. You have an emergency, you take it out, you're good, right? So the fact that your equity is lower is a problem. And of course, the worth of your home. So this is, again, data from the US Census that just came out. And we see for Black people, the value for their home is even less. This is not shocking to you all. We have seen the news, right? People say, oh, it's just the news, a few people. No, the fact is that when you're a Black person who owns a home, even if it's in the best district, we continue to see that it's being devalued at a much higher rate, right? So talk to Perry, right? So Black people alone, their homes are worth less than $100,000. In what market is this? Not here, clearly. Compared to Asian, over 200, almost close to 250. White people a little bit under 150. So the fact is that a group of people less likely to own homes. When they do, there's no equity in it. And then the worth of it is less. So what is the value of home? This is the same pattern you see with education. Likely to get an education. I think 60% of Black women have a degree, but likely to be underemployed, not have benefits, and have a lot of debt. So the numbers don't compute, right? And again, it's not because Black people, Black women are doing something wrong. It's the fact is that we're structured in a way that even when we say go get a home, it's not worth it at the same level as other people. And then finally, just to, and then I'll get into my 3 Ps and the policies, because I want to make sure that you understand this. I mean, I could have thrown at you 500,000 pieces of data. But I want to kind of ground it in some really critical pieces, right? That I think we can actually address infant mortality. We can address maternal mortality. We can actually address wealth gap too, if we really wanted to. And then now we also have to think about young children and parents' concern, right? So in the Rapid EC survey, again, you can Google it. It's with Phil Fisher, who's now at Stanford, And we added in a set of items around discrimination and racism, and this is one of them. We asked families across the board, white families, Latino families, Asians, or Black families, do you have any concerns for your child because of their race, ethnicity? And then we asked them before the pandemic, the purple color, and then after, during the pandemic. And it's lower, right? Where families, and we ask them questions like, do you have any concerns about your child's care and education, or mistreatment, or life choices, all those kind of questions, and really focus on race, ethnicity. And across the board, again, we come to find out that Black families with babies, so these are families with babies, so kids who are infant to 3 years old. So even for families with young children, they're concerned about how fair their children are going to experience life, their opportunities, how they be treated by the police, by adults. The fact is that you're thinking about that when your kid is literally in a stroller. That tells you the compounded nature of being a parent when you're a parent of a Black child in America, is that there's additional layers. Not just, oh, what childcare should I pick? Oh, what activity should I pick? What formula? You are thinking about these other factors. And we often don't ask families, what are your concerns? We ask them, oh, are they talking? Are they moving? Those are important. But we have to understand that these psychological stress are harmful to families who have to bear it by themselves because nobody asks them, do you have any concerns? So now I've complained a lot. So now what are some things that we can do, right? So I won't show this one, but this one's basically families are doing things like talking to their children about, right, the positive of your race, ethnicity, right? They're trying to say, you know what, you're gonna get all this information. Because by the age of 3, kids know themselves by race, ethnicity. By the age of 3. So if you're like, oh my goodness, my baby is 8, they're too young to talk about race, they're innocent. Sorry, by the age of 3 years old, kids literally know how to identify themselves and their friends. They're like, I'm gonna play with this one because I love your whatever. I don't want you here because I don't like your whatever. Kids are able to now distinguish their friendship based on skin color. They may not say Black or white. They may say tan or peach, but they're distinguishing that at the age of 3. If you wait to the age of 8, you're too late. Because America, we tell kids could observe us. They could see everything on TV, whether you want to or not. Their apps. They see how we interact, how we treat each other. They are scientists. So they observe us, and the way they observe us, they see it like, okay, I get it. These group of people, These group of people, They get that message. So it's not shocking by the age of 3, they literally begin to distinguish who is better, who is more human, who deserves, love and attention, who does not, by the age of 3. That's 36 months. They understand that. So we need to also understand that. So what do? Some parents said, let's talk about how important your race is. Let's do cultural socialization, right? Well, let's make sure you're at least proud of your skin color, your culture, your race. So you try to do all of that. But that's not going to be enough. So what can we do here? Now let's move on to what I call the 3 Ps. So to me, as I say, there's a lot the U.S. has done. We got to give them credit. I'm able to stand on this stage as a Black woman and speak to you all. To me, that's progress, right? Before, I probably wouldn't be allowed through the front door. So to me, I have to look at progress. But there's so much more we have to be this exceptional country. There's more we have to do. So I call it 3 Ps. One is we have to protect children from harm and trauma. Like, to me, if nothing else, us as adults, our job should be that, right? So of course, it's not shocking I'll be speaking to the John Lutzker because he talked about protection. How do we protect children from society's ills? Because really, it's adults' ills, to be honest. And then how do we promote their health and wealth and their well-being? Right? To me, you can protect me, but I need you to promote me and the best of who I am. And then I need you to preserve exactly my family, my culture, my language. For people of color, Black people, Native people, that's the one thing we've done. We've stripped away who they are. Many Black people are like, you know what? My beginnings start from enslavement. No, it didn't. If that is your history, is that my history is enslavement, that is the wrong history. That means you stripped Black people of their actual culture, of their actual language, of who they are, right? When somebody strips you of who you are, then you're malleable. They'll tell you you're not worthy, and you're like, okay, I'm not worthy. That in of itself is psychological terror and psychological traumatic. So, what do? First, I don't know why it's playing over again. So what do we do? So to address that, so mine is we sort of looked at the data so far to say, okay, how can we at least begin to address some things, right? Because I believe in the end of it, if we're trying to address issues of protection, we have to do things like civil rights stuff, right? You have to first make sure that my civil liberty, my human rights are protected. We got to do that, right? If we're going to do promotion, Do I have access to well-generated tools, right? Do I have access to good health care, right? If I'm gonna preserve who you are, I might make sure the policies are centering your family. I might make sure they're preserving your culture and your language, right? So those are things that I'm looking for. So what we did in this sort of work, and you can see it also on the website, what we did is that we basically looked at the Policy Impact Center. So, Cynthia Osborne Center, the Prenatal 3 Impact Policy Center, now at Vanderbilt, was at Texas. And when we said, let's see the evidence, right? So she did a whole lot of research, and we wanted to look at it through a critical, anti-racist critical lens about Black people, right? Because a lot of people do a lot of policy analysis. They're like, oh, child tax credit, that works. But for who and under what condition? Because not everything works, right? Because we could argue, you know what, education works. Now, if you look at it really clearly, you'll realize it works-ish, but it works in different ways for different people, right? So we have to really begin to become much more nuanced in understanding what actually works for whom and under what condition. And that's what we did. We looked at all the policies that they looked at, and we took an anti-racist cultural perspective to see, okay, of all the policies you have, which ones actually work specifically for Black people that literally addresses the disparities? Because the problem with a lot of our policies is that we just basically do a race neutral. Oh, you know what? We don't care about racism. We don't care about race. We're going to just look at it. Do they help everybody? And then we go with that. That is the wrong lens. There's no race neutral policy in America. It's a white policy. It's just they don't call it that, but it's not race neutral. So I think I want you to be clear about there's no race neutral policy. We say it is, but they're really not, right? And so that's my challenge to you all, to think through what policies are actually race neutral. They're really not. So what do we do? What do we find? So we looked at it through the 3 Ps lens. Remember, 3 Ps is about protection, promotion, and preservation. So we said, okay, which policies of the 22 policies that you said is effective for infants and toddlers? Let's look at that through the 3 Ps lens, match them up, and also see which ones are most effective for Black people. Not just saying, oh, Black kids did better, is that the disparities would disappear. We want to actually literally reduce, if not close, the disparities. And so what do we find? Of the 22 policies, only 2 really address the protection frame, right? Which means the things that talk about expanded income eligibility for health. That was one of them. And then the reduced administrative burden for SNAP. So for example, when you go to SNAP, they have to do a whole administrative review every year, have you come to the office, check your papers, all this stuff. So they found that reducing administrative burden was actually important and effective, right? It reduced disparities. When we took a deeper look and said, did it reduce disparities for Black people or Black families with babies? It did not. But what did was expansion of income eligibility for health insurance. So Medicaid is not a shocker that Medicaid is always a hot button topic, because we understand when you're able to provide health care to lower income people, and it just happens to be that Black people and Latinos are likely to be lower income, it's a fight. And if you're in the South, it's a fight, right? Because the South is the South, right? So the fact is that we do see that the expanded income eligibility and expanding things like Medicaid and health insurance is actually beneficial for the well-being of Black families, and actually reduces the birth of those who are at the very low birth weight. So it's actually really beneficial to really address that huge gap. But of course, we realize, even in North Carolina, I think they finally are close to actually addressing Medicaid expansion. But I can't remember if in Georgia you all actually, right, okay. See, you'll find the southern states, like Alabama, Mississippi, again, 60% of Black populations live in the Southeast. 60%. I won't talk about Mississippi, because that's the easy one. But the fact is that a lot of southern states know if you do certain things, it's going to disproportionately benefit certain groups of people. So expanded income eligibility is something to think through, because it actually benefits Black people at a plus. It's disproportionately beneficial for Black people. All right, 5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to try to do 5 minutes. So the second one is when we looked at what policies actually fall under promotion. So some of the policies that fall under promotion, I'll make sure so you can see it, are things like state earned income tax credit, prenatal care, fair work scheduling, child care subsidies, qualifications, et cetera. There's a lot that falls into what we call protection. Out of the 22, 10 were found to address disparities writ large, whether income or racial. However, only 3 actually reduced the disparities for Black families, particularly the state minimum wage. So state minimum wage, remember that matters for Black families, which means that it really disproportionately benefited Black families. State earned income tax credits disproportionately benefited Black families for the positive, and paid family leave. So it's interesting, all the things pretty much they wanted to build back better, disproportionately benefited Black families with babies. So if you think about it, when you have minimum wage, when you have earned income tax credit, that is actually helping your money go a little bit deeper. When you have paid family leave, you can actually address medical issues, right? So the things that actually disproportionately benefit Black families, we find is evidence-based and actually address some of our huge, intractable things. But those are things that are hard to pass. So I want to point that out. And then, of course, unfortunately, with the preservation, we come to find there's not a lot of policies that talk about whether it's cultural preservation, family units. Child welfare policies are getting better in that realm, but in early childhood, there's not a lot around language preservation. There's not a lot around even teachers, even making sure that teachers are culturally responsive in their teaching. So we have work to do in terms of preservation, right? Whether it's around issues around workforce diversity and compensation, African-centered curriculum and pedagogy, et cetera. So we have work to do in this space of preservation. But I will flag, if we did reparations, that would help us a lot. So I won't get into reparations just because of time, but I will say that reparations is one of those things where people think, oh my goodness, we can't do reparations. Yeah, we should, because it really addresses the issue of protection and promotion and preservation in deep, deep ways. But we know that America is not ready to apologize or repair the damage done to Black people specifically, right? America is not there. Certain states are doing it, right? In this chart here, and I'll send you my PowerPoint if you want, there are certain parts of the states that are doing it, from California, obviously doing it at the state level, places in Missouri. So this space is doing it, obviously at different levels and different amounts. But reparations is one of those that I say will cover all three Ps if we did it well, right? To attend to issues of civil rights and human rights, attend to issues of wealth generation and health disparities, address issues of cultural preservation. Like, think about it, preserve institutions that are Black, like preserve your museums, preserve your HBCUs. Like, when we can invest in what is Black, the America benefits, right? So these are the things that I think about when we think about reparations as well. So as I sort of close up, I want to sort of just say that in the end of it, we as a nation know what will work for many people. The question is whether we have the will. Because we live in this sort of mentality of, oh my goodness, I have to make sure I get everything and just hoard it. And then nothing is left for anybody else. We live in this survival tactic, and it's not helpful to anybody. And so what we have now is the Black Child National Agenda that was written in partnership with the National Black Child Development Institute, the oldest civil rights organization for young children. And you have a chapter here, BCDI Atlanta. And what we call for are really 10 big policies, right, that are doable. They're being done across this country, from paid family leave, health insurance expansion, addressing racial disparities in wages. We continue to see disparities of 63 cents for a Black woman compared to a white man, right? So addressing that. Maintaining child tax credits, ensuring equity in early intervention. We continue to see huge issues in early intervention and special education. It's not by accident. And of course, I say past reparations. So I hope that sort of my talk has helped you think through what could we do to really address the health and well-being of particularly Black families. And I will argue, when you do something for Black people, everybody benefits. Like, hands down. Whether it's health insurance, hands down. Civil rights protection, it didn't just benefit Black people, it benefited women, white women. It benefits LGBTQIA. So when you do something specific for Black people, everybody really benefits, and our country thrives in many ways by doing that. So I encourage you to look at the Black Child National Agenda. We will do more about that. Again, it's to say that there are things that we can do that we see being done across the country. The question is whether we have the will and we have the way to address it in a way that's meaningful. So as I end, where do you go from here? I encourage you to look at the paper, and really, for me, whether you look at the paper or not, is for you to really think through, how does racism come across in your research, right? Whether it's cultural racism, systemic racism, inter-bias, but also how does it come across in the way you do your research, right? I'm not talking about just the content, but how you do it. Who are you doing it with? If you're being pretty much a sort of an all-white group doing research on Black and brown kids, that in of itself is a problem. That is not fair to the people. That's not even fair to your science. So I say, think about how to think about racism, not just in the content, but also in the way you do it as well, right? And think about the cultural assets of the folks that you work with in many ways. And again, I remind you, look, racism is not about somebody calling me the N-word. I don't even care about that, right? It's about the structure we have created, that even if I go through all the hurdles, the chance of me actually being successful and thriving is hard. Because it's structure, it's an institution, it's a tool. So we have to remember that it's baked into our system. Even if you don't see it, it works. I could die right here and it'd still be alive. That is how deeply entrenched it is in our society. As much as we think it's over, it's not. There's a reason why people are banning books and information about critical race theory. Like, who was studying critical race theory? Well, only some of us, but now it's a thing, right? So remember, it's baked into our system in many ways. And of course, I encourage you to think about the RISE framework. How can you think about racism, but also the resilience and the resistance? Just because people are poor or have low power doesn't mean that they want to be. They're trying, right? But when you do redistricting, you do all sorts of things and you reduce their power, it doesn't mean that they're not trying. So as for you who have power, if you have power in any kind of place, if you're Black and a professor, you have power, right? So everybody has power. So how do you use your power to activate change in your research in the work that you do? And of course, finally, I encourage you to look through the lens of the 3 Ps of how do you go through and protect children and families from the harm, from the trauma, from really the ignoring their civil rights. We have to ensure human rights, right? Human rights means that all of us have a human right to live and thrive, whether or not you like me or not. And we have to really focus on make sure that we're protecting that first. And then promoting people's health, and not just their physical health, but their mental health, their psychological health, right? We have to think about the health of people. And then, of course, their wealth. For me, if you can't develop wealth assets, then all we're doing is just addressing poverty. Like, a lot of our work addresses poverty, but the wealth is really where you get your humanity. When you can basically say, you know what, job? I don't like your job. I'm leaving because you have wealth. Most of us can't, right? If you're poor, you can't just leave a job. So there's things about how do we make sure to develop wealth? And, of course, finally, preservation. Let's make sure that our work is preserving the best of people, their identities, their family, their culture, especially for those communities whose culture has been stripped or made invisible in many ways. So with that, I say thank you, and I look forward to questions, thoughts, comments, and I think I made it, right, okay, almost right on time, sorry, Kathleen. So I will pass the mic back to you.
Dr. Iruka, thank you for that dynamic presentation and bringing our awareness today to think about the science that we do and how we can make a difference. Let's open it up at this time for questions.
Yes, any questions? Good questions. I'm gonna just stand on the stage, y'all. Yes, the brave one. Say your name so I know too, please. Should we get her a mic just so everybody, because I think live streaming, right? And I'll get up.
So you'll see that there's a mic at each side in the middle.
Sorry, I made you get up.
That's okay. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Iruka, for your presentation. Many things struck me. One that I'd like to ask you about is your framework and the assets component. And I've become very interested in asset framing, and in particular in public health, where we're really taught to focus on the problem, right, and the deficits. And having kind of assets really set the stage for presenting a community or a group of people, and then being able to artfully talk about the needs in a community, I think is a really delicate balance. And I wonder if you have some words of wisdom, or you could talk about what you've been doing in your own work to integrate that assets piece?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that question, because it also gives me a chance to remind, so Yoso, who's a professor in San Diego, UC San Diego, she had sort of this framework, the community cultural wealth, and so it's adapted from that. And so for me, it was important that we begin to humanize, right, our particularly marginalized communities. And so for the work that I do, that I had not created items. Right, because people are like, I want to do strength-based work, but we don't know what that means, because in the end of it, funders want to fund people who got problems. Let's be honest. Funders are like, look, who has the problems? I don't care about, I want problems. That's how funders fund, which in of itself is bad, so we have a whole other issue around the philanthropic community. But the way I have done it is really, first and foremost, is to really, in some ways, personalize my research, because I live poverty. I lived what my mother did, right? And I try to say, what did she do? And I would talk to her, what did she do? So I feel like in many ways, I personalized, will my mother agree with this question? And the way, am I missing something? So that's one. But two is that we do have items that's called the Family Cultural Wealth Survey that ask about, issues of spirituality, that ask about aspirations. Like, I'll give you one quick scenario. So if you remember back in 1965, when Robert Moynihan, Moynihan, the labor secretary, was basically wrote the report, why the pathology of Negro people. If you remember, if you actually read the report, you'll see literally he laid out this idea that the pathology of black people is so horrible, we are in trouble, the women are kicking the men away, all these pathology. But then Robert Hill, who was then, I think, at the NAACP or National Urban League, I can't remember, wrote another piece that says, look, there's so many assets to black families. How many people do you know were enslaved and go to work, go to school when they're not wanted, have different ways of creating a family? So he actually, for me, he was the beginner of shaping this idea of assets, because he said there's so many assets, it's just that the way you continue to look at black people through this pathological lens is not helpful. And then your policies reify that pathological lens. Like you're like welfare, oh, you all just sit at home and don't get a job and lazy. That tells you what people think about certain groups of people. And so for me, the way I do the work is that making sure that I'm able to capture it. And the framework is one way to say, you know what, we could talk about racism, but we have to also talk about the fact that people are actively trying to resist the impact of it, right? But they don't have control. They can't control all the systems levers, right? But they are things that they're bringing to that. And the more we can actually show, funders or whoever, policymakers, and that's what I'm trying to do at my own center, is the more I can show you that, yes, there are these challenges, right? Reminding them it's not because they wanted to be poor or et cetera, that things happen that was created probably before they were born, but that here's all the things that they're doing. If you tell somebody, you know what, I'm trying to go to school, they think of you differently than if they assume, oh, you just didn't go to school. That framing may be nuanced, but it's really important to change a policymaker's mind to say, you know what, they're trying to go to school. How do we make it easier, cheaper, more affordable? That's a different conversation. That's a different policy. So for me, it's both showing them the science of the impact of seeing people as humans, and then what does that mean for the kind of policies we actually either pass or the policies that we revise. So for me, it's both in the research part, but also in the way that I talk to policymakers about, you can't say that you love somebody if you don't know their full humanity. You don't know all their assets, as well as the challenges. And so for me, I do it in both of those spaces. And in that report that I mentioned, you'll kind of see how we try to sort of lay up some of the challenges, but also the assets of families. And I can share another report if you're interested.
Harry?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, and really appreciate the focus on context. And while you were apologetic about all the framing you were doing before you dove into the, I have the same obsession, because without the framework, you can't contextualize the information. And if you don't contextualize the information, you lose it. So as someone who's also interested and engaged in the intersection of policy and equity, and there are a lot of cities and counties and states that are trying to bring both an equity lens broadly and a racial equity lens more specifically to their work. I'm intrigued by the 3P approach and the analysis you did. And I guess the one question I have is, it was obviously a very small number of the relative whole that met all the Ps.
Yep.
But does that mean that we can't move the needle if we're just pushing 1P or 2Ps? And I'm wondering what you're thinking about that. And it's a challenge of, we can't always get everything we want, but can we move things the right direction if we can get part of what we want or part of what we need?
Yeah, I love that question, because you don't want to be the perfect, be the enemy of the good, right? That's the question. And of course, I want to say, like, if you at least do one, give me at least one, right? I would say, give me one, right? And the challenge with that is that if you give me one, most of us stop at one, right? Because most people are like, I just want to find the basic part. But if you're trying to really, to me, if you're trying to really address this institution that has been created, I find it to sort of do even half of it probably won't be enough. Oh, get us somewhere. I think I would say yes, move forward with whatever portion goes forward. Like if it's like, okay, we can only do state income, state tax income credit, fine, do that. At least be as a beginning, but don't let that be the end. Because that's the problem that we have here, is that we're like, oh, I see an effect for something, pre-K, let's just do pre-K. But you realize pre-K is just a thing. It's 1 year. It's 9 months. And if you do that and stop there, everything gets lost anyways. So I guess for me, it's almost like, yes, start where you can. And I think with many policymakers, start where you can, because you have to, as somebody who was in Nebraska and now North Carolina, negotiating with policymakers, start where you can. But I'm going to be blunt. If you're trying to have these huge effects and you're trying to really address the racial equity stuff, you got to go all the way in, because doing it halfway, you get halfway. And I think that's the struggle of, yes, you have to kind of manage people, manage funds and all that. But I would say if you can do at least one in each of the categories, right? Think about issues of civil rights, for example, or even wealth. That's getting me somewhere. So I do think, yes, you can, but I would encourage you where you can to say we eventually want to get to all three, because all three is really where we need to be if we're trying to really address the big elephant in the room, which is the fact that you have stripped the wealth from people, and you continue to strip the wealth from people. So it's compounded interest. You kind of owe. And so I would encourage people to really think through the lens of 3P. And if there's something you can do in each of the Ps, then great. And reparations was a good example. Whether you call it something else, but if you think of reparations in the fullest of forms, it's not just money transference. It's also the fact that you're going to say, you know what, I acknowledge what I have caused. Sometimes it's not the money, it's the fact that you are now saying, I am apologizing publicly, earnestly for the damage I have done, and I'm going to repair that damage. That has never been done. So maybe even starting there doesn't even require money. It requires a will to acknowledge the people you have destroyed and try to dehumanize. And so reparations to me is one of those that's both monetary, but also it's a psychological thing. It's also civil and human rights. To me, if you do that, you got all the 3 Ps in there. But I think that's a good question. Start where you can, but don't let it be the end.
We have time for one more question.
Pick it up. Thank you again for today. When you were starting your research into structural and non-structural racism, I guess who were some of the people that you were reading, or some of the, publications you were reading?
Oh my God, yeah, get the paper. It has all the references. But obviously, like Cameron P. Jones is huge. I mean, even reading MLK. People don't think about it. If you actually, MLK was 35 years old when he got assassinated. I'm 43. He was a brilliant man who could see how it worked and how it was transferred. So, but folks like that, Jones, I was reading. So David Williams, obviously another big one who does a lot in the health disparities world. But I would say, the paper, we have a lot of citations, but some of those really premier people, Cynthia Garcia-Cole with some of her framework, the folks who did critical race theory. So you'll see in the paper a good citation. But I try to really lean into some of the Black, indigenous sort of folks who have been doing this work, but their works have been made invisible, right? So it's trying to elevate also Black scholars who have written about these sort of racism in many forms. And so in the paper, you'll see how we define racism clearly, because there's different levels of it. We think systemic racism, yeah-ish, but it's cultural, right? There's also interpersonal, there's vicarious. Enrique Neblett over now at University of Michigan. So there's people that we sort of cite that I think once you start reading their papers, you're like, you're speaking my language. So we did have a few people that we cited, but I'm happy to send the paper to you if you're interested. I think it's a good paper, y'all. So yeah, it's gonna be in a special issue, so I'm gonna make sure it is though.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iruka. Just a warm, small token of our appreciation to your members here at GSU. And then I would invite everyone to join us across the hall for a reception.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
And then La La Land, thank you. Thank you all for coming and staying. Isn't there traffic? Your traffic is brutal. Don't forget your phone. Yeah, I can't forget that.